I got a call from the Dean of Admissions asking if you were to get in to Harvard, would you accept? And I said yes, because I knew my mom would kill me if I said anything else.
As soon as I found out about Berkeley, I knew I need to be at this school. This is the perfect school for me.
The first few weeks, I made some of my best friends. I played a lot of sports. I was basically a straight-A student.
And then everything changed in one night.
This guy came up to me and he took me away from my friends.
He grabbed my arm and started pulling me. I kept pulling away and he would pull me back, and he was a really strong guy.
He took me behind the house and assaulted me.
He banged my head against a wall.
I was roofied.
When you're bleeding that much, when you're scared, when you don't know what's happening to you, you hope that you don't die. And that's what I was hoping, that I had more than just 20 years to live.
My rape was bad, but the way it was treated was worse.
They kept asking me, what were you wearing?
He told me we shouldn't go out in short skirts and we shouldn't drink because, I mean, that's our fault.
Did you say no? How many times did you say no? How did you say it?
They told me, despite the fact that I had a written admission of guilt, that what I presented to them could only prove that he loved me.
There's a lot of victim blaming with this crime, which has a silencing effect on survivors.
The vast majority of the men who commit these crimes are completely undetected. It's almost a risk-free crime.
It turns out that he had actually assaulted other women in the past.
They found 2 other girls that he had previously raped.
If you have 4 survivors that are reporting a serial perpetrator and you're not taking action, what is it going to take?
We started seeing, what was happening at campuses across the country.
Hi.
Why has no one connected the dots before?
These students went from sexual assault victims to survivors and now activists.
My name is Carolyn Luby.
My name is Alexa Schwartz.
My name is Ari Mostov.
This is a national problem.
We are fed up!
I was getting threatened. It was working in their favor to silence me, and I was terrified.
I thought if I told them, they would take action, but the only action they took was against me.
We've got a lot further to go.
Which has provided some of the input for what the university is doing on this very serious problem. And the second clip is the response to this problem.
We've known for probably 25 years now that the problem of sexual assault on college campuses is enormous.
I think a lot of parents think, well, we'll drop our daughter off, she'll have a great college experience, and everything will be fine because the college has a reputation for being a safe place. It's not.
I learned later on that I wasn't the only one who was raped that weekend. But at the time, we didn't talk about it because it was something that nobody talked about. Rape's a scary word. You don't want to fall into a category. You don't want to be called the victim. I did not want to admit that it happened to me.
So I told this administrator I was violently raped, and we're sitting down at this point, and she looks at me and she's like, "Rape is like a football game, Annie. And if you look back on the game, what would you do differently in that situation?" I was expecting resources, I was expecting support, and instead she gives me this metaphor that rape is football, and it made no sense. And I asked her, no, rape is not like football at all. And she's like, well, were you drunk, and what would you have done differently if you could replay the situation again? And I was just getting blamed and blamed and blamed for this.
They kept asking me, what were you wearing? What were you drinking? How much did you have to drink? Did you pregame?
He kind of just lectured us about how we shouldn't go out in short skirts and we shouldn't drink because, I mean, that's our fault.
Did you say no? How many times did you say no? How did you say it? Okay, what were you wearing?
There was no response. There was no response for 7 months.
I thought that if I told them, they would take action,
but the only action they took was against me.
After I was sexually assaulted, they said I should just drop out until everything blows over out of school.
I went back into her office and I asked her what happened, and she looked me right in the eye and told me that she forgot.
The school's response always seemed like they were more concerned about him and his needs.
She said, you don't know what he's going through right now, neither do I. He could be really having a hard time.
They also told me, despite the fact that I had a written admission of guilt from him, that I didn't have enough evidence, and that in fact what I had presented to them could only prove that he loved me.
There's a lot of victim blaming with this crime, which has a silencing effect on survivors.
So now to begin proceedings, I'm really delighted to see you all here today. The Ideas in Society program has been going for several years now. The aim is to both enliven intellectual debate, but also to show what is the historic connection between this university and society more generally. And I think one of the distinctive things about La Trobe is our connection to broader society and the way we take that responsibility seriously. I'm absolutely delighted with the speakers we have today, and they'll be introduced by our Vice-Chancellor. I also would like to take the opportunity that I have now to publicly thank the Vice-Chancellor who's chairing today for the extraordinary support he's given to the program. There are now two very important programs showing our connection to the society more generally. This one I think is important, but also there's a new program called Bold Thinking, which shows in forums the place that our academics are playing in identifying and researching some of the more central problems of the society. So I think we're coming up to our 50th anniversary as a university. I've almost been here as long as that. And I think it's a great time to think about the kind of deeper role in the society that this particular university has played and will continue to play. So with all that, if I could ask the speakers, I think, and the Vice-Chancellor, John Dewar, to come up to the stage, and I'll then try and get off the stage.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that very generous introduction, and welcome everyone. It's great to see so many of you here today. I'm here essentially to be your host and MC for today, and I will begin by saying a few words about Ideas in Society and this event in particular, and then I'll introduce our three very distinguished speakers. This has been a great year for the Ideas in Society programme. A while ago, you'll remember that Rob introduced Walid Ali as one of his guests. I don't think we've ever had in 1 year, Rob, a Gold Logie winner and Australian of the Year, who we have with us today. But that your pulling power is extraordinary, Rob. Congratulations. But we've already hosted two very thoughtful discussions, one on writing on the dark aspects of human nature, and the other on climate change after the 2015 Paris Climate Summit, both of which were fascinating in very different ways. And then we had a session in the Bold Thinking series that Rob referred to, which was the Walid Ali event. Now, our topic today is Australia's hunting grounds, power, privilege, and preventing violence. And I think this is a very timely discussion to have. Issues of violence in our community have received a fair amount of publicity recently for various different reasons. I think it's true to say that Australian society is only just beginning to come to grips with the fact that a woman dies at the hands of a current or former partner almost once a week, and that one woman in 3 has experienced physical violence, and 1 woman in 5 has experienced sexual violence in some form. Those statistics are starting to filter out into the public domain and starting to trigger a response on the part of our political and policy leaders. The Hunting Ground, of which you've seen a short extract in the trailer, has also done a lot, I think, to shine a light on sexual violence on university campuses, and obviously that brings it much closer to home for La Trobe and other universities, and we may hear more later on about what we're planning to do about all of that. And then last month, and this really brings it right home, one of La Trobe's second-year health science students, Patrick Cronin, lost his life to the senseless violence of a so-called coward's punch. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that in the light of all of those statistics that violence is becoming an epidemic. But while the statistics are, are indeed shocking, and those of you who've seen the full movie, The Hunting Ground, will know, what makes these revelations, what these revelations show us is the scale of the change we now need to make. And I think starting at La Trobe, we have an opportunity to make a very, very positive difference. At the beginning of the year, La Trobe established something called Project Unified to ensure that our campuses are safe and respectful places for everyone on them. The project team, most of whom I think are here today, are developing education support and violence prevention initiatives as part of the positive changes that are needed to ensure that our campuses are safe for everyone. And Australian universities as a group have come together under our peak body, Universities Australia, to work on a national project to address sexual assault on university campuses called Respect Always Now. I think university communities have a particular responsibility to tackle this issue because of our ability to educate and to influence public opinion. Which brings me to today's panel, and once again Rob has done a fantastic job of assembling our speakers today. And what I'm going to do is to introduce our first speaker, and I'll let him speak, and then I'll introduce the second speaker, let her speak, and then the third speaker, and then I'll orchestrate the Q&A session at the end. So our first speaker is Lieutenant General David Morrison, someone who I'm sure will be well known to all of you. General Morrison is the 2016 Australian of the Year. He concluded his appointment as Australia's Chief of Army in May 2015. During a 36-year career as a soldier, he saw operational service in Bougainville and East Timor, and as an Australian Army officer, led troops from platoon level all the way up to being a 3-star General Chief of Army, an appointment that he held for the last 4 years of his service in the Army. His loyalty to his profession and his outstanding service to the nation was recognised when he was made an officer in the Order of Australia in 2010. But in his tenure at the top of Australia's army, General Morrison is probably best known for his strong public stance on gender equality and leading cultural change in the armed forces and in the army in particular. And some of you will have seen his 3-minute video, which is on YouTube somewhere close to you, that he circulated to his workforce in the wake of a particular instance of poor behaviour by a group of officers and senior soldiers. As I say, it was posted on YouTube and it's since been viewed more than 1.7 million times. I think that counts as going viral, David. He has spoken about diversity and culture to the United Nations International Women's Day Conference in New York and was a closing speaker with Angelina Jolie, William Hague and John Kerry at the Global Summit to Prevent Sexual Violence in Military Conflict in London in 2014. He has become a leading advocate for eliminating violence against women, and he's currently chair of the Diversity Council of Australia, a board member of Our Watch, and a male champion of change. It's now my great pleasure to hand over to Lieutenant General David Morrison. David.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank La Trobe University for giving me the opportunity to be part of this afternoon's session. I'll start, as I always do, by acknowledging the first people of this country. We meet on their lands. They are the custodians of this great island continent, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also want to pay my respects, as I do with every public engagement, I have done now for about 18 months, and I will do so for probably as long as I speak publicly. I want to acknowledge the victims of domestic violence in this country. I think domestic violence is probably our greatest social issue, and as I point out to my audiences in the corporate world and in the philanthropic and not-for-profit area, we all have a role, both professionally as well as personally, in trying to make a difference to the world that our sons and particularly our daughters will live in the future. Domestic violence is absolutely linked to the violence that you are addressing in this session this afternoon on campus. Both of them, in my view, stem from gender inequality, and gender inequality stems largely from the culture that inculcates us from our moment of birth. Now, I've just said something that is pretty sweeping. I have no academic qualifications to provide an educated view on culture, although I'm going to define it for you all in just a moment. But in this audience, I probably need to get that caveat on the table. And clearly I'm going to speak about being victims or being discriminated against, but I am a middle-aged Anglo-Saxon heterosexual male, and I've never been discriminated against in my life. Well, at least up until probably the point that I was made the Australian of the Year, and then certain elements of the Fourth Estate decided that they could have a red-hot go, but I didn't feel discriminated against. Now, we live in a democracy. People have got their right to share their view. What I'm talking about is being denied the opportunity to live your life safely and to reach your potential. And all forms of violence, particularly in this case sexual violence, does just that. It strips away confidence, self-respect and dignity. It blights a life, and it absolutely denies people the opportunity, men and women, to reach their potential in life. And when we allow inside our society, inside our culture, those things to occur, we are all the loser. Now, I think there's, for most Australians, quite a novelty factor to someone who's never experienced discrimination, standing up as the Australian of the Year in 2016 and speaking about these matters around domestic violence and around what true diversity actually brings. Diversity of thinking based on respect for other people's views. Not agreement, but respect. But it's given me the opportunity to be involved in engagements such as this. I spoke at the University of Australia's convention in Canberra a couple of months ago and said to a number of Vice-Chancellors and leaders of our universities around Australia that I would be really delighted if I was given the opportunity to come and do what I'm doing here at La Trobe. Because I think that if you can consider universities as the absolute generators of future leadership in Australia, and you have academic bodies and administrative staff in contemporary Australia's universities now turning their attention to the issues raised by the hunting ground and our own Indigenous studies into these areas, then that is an absolutely positive sign for the future, but it doesn't solve our contemporary issues. Now, I've come a long way since I started my tenure as your Chief of Army in 2011. And I do want to go back to that moment because I want to demonstrate just how far you can change. I then want to, in this august audience, define culture for you, which may put the anthropological department out of business, I don't know. And then I want to make some practical, and I guess probably general-like, observations about what a university campus could perhaps do. And I've got 15 minutes left, and I'm not going to go over time. So coming into the job as the Chief of Army in June of 2011, I was of the view that the incident that had occurred at our university, the Australian Defence Force Academy, in February of 2011, which has gone into the Australian lexicon under the unfortunate title of the ADFA Skype scandal, was much more about the individuals concerned than it was about the national institution of the Australian Army. Let me just explain what happened and then slightly expand on that view to make the point that I want to make. A group of young men, first-year students in their very first month at ADFA, conspired to, so that one of their number convinced an unwitting female victim to engage in a consensual sex act with him, and unknown to her, that act was recorded by a hidden camera streamed over Skype to men in the other room. Now, my view coming into the job was, I think, probably that of the majority of the army, but I'll go further than that, probably the majority of Australians, and not just men. That their actions was much more reflective of them, their upbringing, their family, their friends at school, than anything that it said about an institution that was well over 100 years old. And whatever your view about military service is, and it probably in this audience differs quite dramatically from mine, the Army is a great national institution. It has within its brand names like Gallipoli and Kokoda. And its brand is rooted in the 102,000 names that sit on the Roll of Honour at our War Memorial, men and women who put service before self in our name and never came back to Australia. I am now of the view, however, that what I believed in 2011 was wrong, and I have moved 180 degrees. I now am absolutely certain that those young men were drawn to the Army's culture, were drawn to a very distorted and quite erroneous view of a male-dominated hierarchical organisation where, in their own skewed view of reality, their actions would be somehow tacitly condoned. They weren't. They were all discharged eventually from the Army, but the matter was not well handled. I talk about culture, so let me define it for you, and for the anthropologists in the audience, I apologise. Culture is largely the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. We are surrounded by those stories from the moment of our birth. They shape our lives, they shape the teams that we may play sport within, they shape our professions, they shape our academic institutions. I could prove it to you, in fact I will. I'll say 2 words to you now and I'll tell you all what you thought, okay? Just so that I can get my academic qualifications up in this audience. Aussie digger. You've thought of a male who is white, Anglo-Saxon, a natural soldier who fights best with a hangover, probably from a rural background who never salutes officers, especially the POMs. I think that probably very few of you thought of a man or woman of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander heritage, or a man or woman of Muslim faith, or a man or woman who identified with Asian heritage. Those 2 words have a world of meaning encapsulated in them. I had the opportunity here in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago to speak to one of the big 4 banks. I gave them that story and then said if I was to transpose Aussie digger for Aussie banker, what would be the image, not necessarily in your minds, but in the minds of broader Australia? Words have power, culture have power, they shape our lives. And so when you are trying to make changes, you need to recognise both the strengths and the weaknesses of culture. You see, Aussie digger says to a man or woman who don't fit the stereotype that I portray, don't join, don't come, and if you do, the hurdles that you are going to be asked to jump will be far higher than the hurdles that David Morrison was ever asked to jump. But when you break down the stories, when you actually say to your workforce, these stories are exclusive, not inclusive. They lead to disrespect, not to respect. They do absolutely propagate violence within our profession internally, not externally, as armies are charged to do under the Constitution. They are debilitating when we want to be the most professional army the nation could possibly want. Lights do come on. Change is possible. We're talking about human nature, its strengths and its weaknesses. And my fellow speakers will offer much better insights into that, but my view is that human nature is really sticky. It's hard to change because culture is with us from the moment of our birth. Nonetheless, you can change it. You need to lead, you need to be passionate about it, you need to gain the right data, analyse it correctly and portray the results of that analysis so that it means something to the audience that you are trying to change. But as the hunting ground is starting to prove on campuses inside America, change can happen, and it can happen, in cultural terms, relatively quickly. So, conscious of the time, I'm going to offer a view here that could be seen as ex-military. At least I've got the caveat on the table. And I'm going to approach a very complex subject in a generalist way, but gosh, if anyone in this room is qualified to do that, it'd be me, wouldn't it? As a retired general. It means that I can say virtually anything without having to substantiate it. No, I'm going to offer relatively simple solutions to these complex problems, and I do so, and here I'm going to quote someone that you didn't think would be quoted at La Trobe today, Ronald Reagan, in doing so. Ronald Reagan observed that there are many complex problems and they all have simple solutions, and every simple solution is wrong. And he was right. So these are complex. But here's my view. You will not make meaningful change here unless you care for the victims, listen to their stories without judgment and with compassion, and are able to take actions against alleged perpetrators. Let me deal with the alleged perpetrators first. If there is an allegation of sexual assault, sexual predation, bullying and harassment, there are a number of recourses for the staff, those that hold positions of responsibility here at La Trobe University. Depending on the nature of the incidents, it may well be referred to the civilian police. And when that happens, the police will take some time to investigate it, and they will then decide, in concert with the Director of Public Prosecution, whether there is a case to answer and whether a successful prosecution could, under our rules of law, actually be sustained. It's pretty simple when the police decide, yes, there is a case to answer. Then I think the decision is binary for all of you. The perpetrator may be still alleged, but his or her actions are now the subject of criminal investigation and they should be removed from the campus. Absolutely, they should be removed. It is, in my view, unconscionable that a perpetrator, even yet proven, would share the campus with an alleged victim. We made that mistake in the army countless times, and we've now, I think, largely eradicated it to the betterment of the organisation and to all of the individuals within it. Where the police decide that they are not going to prosecute, issues become more complex without a doubt, but there has to be some means by which a university deals with the issue, because not dealing with it leads to what was portrayed in the hunting ground and is in fact the status quo within, I think, far too many campuses and organisations, not just here in Australia but around the world. So there needs to be a means by which the victim is heard and the alleged perpetrator is also heard and given the opportunity, of course, to establish the facts of the matter. This is not prejudging the issue, but the university needs to stand on one particular side of a line. And there needs to be an absolutely articulated code of conduct with expectations, and when those expectations are not lived up to, action needs to be followed. And whether that is the termination of a period of study at the university, whether it is suspension of a period of study for a period of time, whether it is something else, I will leave that to the university experts. But you must demonstrate intent. That's really my message. You won't find it in any leadership manual or book that festoons the shelves of newsagents, libraries or booksellers, but there is a psychology to a public hanging. Yes, you heard me say that. Human nature is such that we are absolutely riveted by the consequences of actions. And for too long, in my view, in Australia, whether it's in the military or in the banking sector or the mining sector or the public service or the world of academia, consequences happen but with no subsequent actions. And that needs to change. I said it was a simplistic approach, But really, you only have to do this and maintain or keep the faith for it to have dramatic impacts on the university. I know because this is the stance we took inside the army. We tried to lower the flash to bang time. We tried to absolutely give the opportunities for victims to be listened to give their account of what had happened, and for actions to take place. And yes, of course it is untidy. It's always going to have its own issues. But once you are manifestly and publicly committed to this course of action, it does change culture, and it does change, to a degree, human nature. I'm fond of quoting Machiavelli. I'm going to do so again today because I think that Machiavelli, for all the bad press he might get outside of the study of political philosophy, actually cuts to the chase in a way that very few writers do. He observed in Renaissance Italy that there's no more delicate a matter to take in hand nor more doubtful in its success than to set up as a leader of change, for he who innovates will have for his enemies all those who are well off under the existing order of things. Let me tell you, those who are well off under the existing order of things in this country share my sex or gender, they share my racial heritage, they are given the chance time and again, like I was, to live a privileged life, to fail safely and to move on to the next hurdle, which will always be lower in height than the woman who is running next to me. If that sounds like a sweeping generalisation, well, I'm going to stand by it, and on it I'm going to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Well done. Impressive. Thank you very much, David. I'm sure there's lots of food for thought there that we can come back to in the question and answer session at the end. But let's go on to our second speaker, who is our very own Dr. Nicola Henry. Nicola is a senior lecturer in crime, justice and legal studies here at La Trobe University. She teaches in the areas of discrimination, human rights, social justice, transitional justice and international criminal law. She's written on a wide range of issues with specific focus on sexual violence, law, power and justice. She's published groundbreaking research on rape culture. Her books include War and Rape, Law, Memory and Justice, and Rape Justice Beyond the Criminal Law, the latter of which was co-edited with Dr. Anastasia Powell and Dr. Asher Flynn. Her most recent book, Sex, Violence and Justice in a Digital Era, co-authored as well with Dr. Powell, will be released later this year. Please welcome Dr. Nicola Henry. Nicola.
Well, it's a very hard act to follow the Australian of the Year, so forgive me. I'd like to start by thanking Professor Robert Manne, Professor John Dewar, and also Corinne Manning for inviting me today. And I'd like to also thank all of you for coming. I've got lots of my students here, my undergrad students I can see down the back, and postgrad students, and I've got a lot of colleagues here as well, and there's a number of you that I don't recognise, but thank you so much for coming today. So I wanted to start my presentation with a well-known case. In 2012 in Steubenville, Ohio, an unconscious 16-year-old girl was raped by two high school football players. The rapes were recorded on digital devices by onlookers who then distributed the images via mobile phones and via websites such as Facebook, YouTube and Instagram. The notorious photos of the unconscious victim, otherwise known as Jane Doe, depicted her being carried by her around by her wrists and her legs, with her head dangling on the ground. Jane Doe was ridiculed and blamed for the rapes, even though she was completely unconscious. She became known in some circles as Steubenville's train whore. The two accused, on the other hand, were presented in the media as two promising high school football players. They received widespread sympathy from the media and from their communities, who were concerned about what the case would do to their careers. This example is not specifically about sexual assault on campus, but it does point to the types of sexual violence that we're seeing in our schools, in our universities, and in our communities, and the problems surrounding the institutional responses to them. This example also points to the troubling trend in the use of digital technologies as a further form of control, power, and harassment over and above the sexual assault. The case also points to problems of victim blaming, perpetrator exoneration, and overall the dismal failure of the criminal justice system and other institutional responses to respond adequately to rape and sexual assault in our community. Some have further argued that the example, and many more other examples that I could use, point to a problem of a rape culture within our community. The Hunting Ground documentary is a shocking affirmation of all of these problems and highlights the extent to which universities will go to protect their reputation and their brand. Recently here in Australia, we've had a fair bit of media attention to a range of cases, including a sexual assault at the University of Sydney at a college party that was covered up and poorly dealt with by the university. There have been a number of other sexual assault incidences, I believe, at the same university, where a man has plied first-year students with alcohol at college parties and then somehow got them back to his house and raped them. We've got the examples of chanting of misogynist songs on university campuses very recently. Back in 2009, a pro-rape Facebook page that was set up. Also, Melbourne University recently has been in the news for a Facebook page that rated the attractiveness of university students and also hosted nude and sexually explicit images of women without their consent. Like everywhere else in the world, sexual assault is extremely common in Australia. The Australian Bureau of Statistics reports that 1 in 5 Australian women and 1 in 22 Australian men have experienced sexual assault since the age of 15. Just so you know, sexual assault in the ABS survey is defined more broadly to include physical assaults of a sexual nature. So it also includes penetrative offences, otherwise known as rape, but it doesn't include unwanted sexual touching. So in 2012, they removed unwanted sexual touching from that definition. The startling findings across various country and multi-country studies on sexual violence point to what the World Health Organization has described as a pervasive global public health problem of epidemic proportions. In a recent study, the World Health Organization found that overall 35% of women worldwide reported having experienced physical and/or sexual violence at the hands of an intimate partner, or sexual violence by a friend, family member, acquaintance, or stranger. Police data consistently show that while men report having experienced forms of non-sexual violence more frequently than women, women and children continue to represent the majority of victims of sexual violence, while perpetrators continue to be overwhelmingly, although not exclusively, male. Young women in particular continue to be at highest risk of experiencing sexual assault, and most likely at the hands of a known man, a family member, a boyfriend, a friend, an acquaintance, rather than at the hands of a stranger. According to the National Union of Students survey from 2015, 27% of Australian university students had experienced some form of sexual assault while enrolled at their current university. 14% had experienced a rape or an attempted rape, 96% said the perpetrator was male, and less than 6% reported the incident to their university, and less than 5% reported the incident to police. Universities are a prime site for sexual aggression because, as US scholar Mary Koss notes, universities are closed institutions, much like the military and prisons. Universities are also where people live, work, play and study, all in the same environment. Young people are likely to be away from home for the first time in their lives. A toxic drinking culture combined with the normalisation of problematic attitudes, beliefs and behaviours in relation to gender, violence and sexuality also mean that it is perhaps not surprising that there are high rates of sexual aggression and sexual victimisation among our student cohorts. Part of the reason why sexual violence is so prevalent and widespread, both globally and locally, has to do with the way in which the crime is treated in our society. For instance, a perpetrator need not fear going to court since it's unlikely that they'll end up in the criminal justice system if they know the victim, or if the rape can somehow be made to look like sex. In Australia, like most other common law jurisdictions, reporting, arrest, prosecution and conviction rates for rape are incredibly low. For example, people who are sexually assaulted are the least of all victims to report the crime to police. Approximately 85% of victims do not report sexual violence due to fear, shame and concern about how they'll be treated in the criminal justice system and how they'll be viewed in the community more generally. Of the 15% that do actually report to police, only between 15 and 20% actually result in arrests and a charges being laid. A lack of evidence often leads prosecutors and the police to drop the charges against the accused, and this is known as attrition, the gradual whittling away of cases so that only very few cases actually proceed to trial. The perpetrator is also less likely to plead guilty than any other defendant in the criminal justice system and is 3 times more likely to receive an acquittal than any other defendant. The conviction rate is much higher, which might come as no surprise to all of you here. The conviction rate is much higher if the case involves threat, force or injury, particularly if a weapon is used. But the problem is not simply within our criminal justice system. In fact, the operation of the criminal justice system is heavily influenced by powerful societal ideas, beliefs and assumptions about gender, violence and sexuality. And these discourses play an incredibly powerful role in how judges, police, jurors, lawyers and others, including the victims themselves, respond to rape. One of the greatest barriers to reporting rape or sexual assault is the stigma that is attached to being a victim of rape and the absence of a safe space, both publicly and privately, in which victims can disclose their experiences. And this is, of course, completely unfair and needs to change. It's heartening to see, for instance, the Royal Commission inquiry into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, which has provided a space for victims to come forward after what has been decades of silence for many victim survivors. On average, and this is really interesting, on average the Royal Commission is hearing from 37 people a week seeking a private session with the Commissioner to share their experiences in a private, safe setting. So we have to be able to talk about sexual assault within our community, and we have to allow victims to come forward, either publicly or privately, and to tell their stories and to receive the support they might need. Equally, though, we have to respect that some victims might not want to come forward and might prefer to be silent about their experiences. But we do nonetheless need to create a space where they can be heard and respected and supported. Part of the challenge is to teach bystanders, friends, family members, work colleagues, lecturers, tutors and others, to be able to respond supportively when someone discloses being a victim of rape or sexual assault. And this means we need to work, we need to continue working on dismantling problematic stereotypes about rape victims. And these stereotypes include the kind of more extreme or outrageous rape myths. For instance, if she was wearing a short skirt, then she deserved to be raped, or that she was using rape as a way to get attention. But these stereotypes also include things like notions that the rape victim is forever damaged, traumatised and spoiled. According to the National Community Attitudes Towards Violence Against Women survey, which was conducted in 2013 by Vic Health, 43% of Australians thought that rape is a result of a man being unable to control his sexual desire, 43%. 38% agreed in the survey that women say they were raped when they'd led a man on and later had regrets. And it was young people aged between 16 and 25 who had the poorer understandings and attitudes. But this is not surprising when you reflect on the problem and the pervasiveness of everyday sexism. As UK academic Liz Kelly notes, it is useful to think about sexual violence on a continuum. This enables us to recognise the commonalities between different forms of violence and harassment and how gender inequality and discrimination links them all together. This includes violent acts such as murder and rape, but it includes everyday sexism that women face on a daily basis, including street harassment, being leered at, honked at, catcalled, as well as online forms of harassment such as rape jokes and hate speech on the basis of one's gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and race. Like rape and sexual assault, examples of street and online harassment are further examples of the power and privilege in public and private spaces being exerted over women. Women's experiences of everyday sexism and sexual harassment and unwanted touching, groping, leering, derogatory sexist comments, to me seems like grooming, if I can use that word. Now, I know that the word grooming is usually reserved to describe the activities of child sexual offenders who are setting up a situation so that they can abuse a child and get away with it. But I think the word grooming, the word grooming, I looked it up in the dictionary, actually means to prime, to make ready for something else. Girls are essentially being groomed from a very young age to expect that their bodies are public property, that they are objects of desire, not subjects, and that they should just remain calm and silent about it or take it as a compliment. And above all, they should not make a fuss. And if they do make a fuss, then they will suffer the consequences. After the release of the Hunting Ground documentary, some of the victims appearing in the film have been questioned about the credibility of their narratives. The film has been discredited as dangerous and disingenuous piece of propaganda, and many have expressed outrage at the injustice done to the named football star in the documentary. So according to US columnist Emily Yoffe, quote, "It's a story of an ambiguous sexual encounter among young adults that almost destroyed the life of the accused, a young black man with no previous record of criminal behaviour," end quote. This grooming, the silencing, the stigmatising processes are further entrenched and reinforced through our institutions when they cover up sexual assault, when they don't take action, when they exonerate the perpetrator, or when they too contribute to victim blaming. And we know from experience from the Royal Commission inquiry into child sexual abuse that institutions are notorious for doing all of these things. But what about the perpetrator? And luckily we do have Troy here, who's far more qualified to speak about perpetrators. But I'm going to say a couple of things about perpetrators. I think this is a good chance to say that most men do not abuse women, and most men are respectful of women, but there are a good number who are not. As most perpetrators of rape never go to trial, we actually know very little about the undetected perpetrator of sexual assault, and we need to place more attention to them. The problem, of course, is that as they go undetected, because the reporting, the arrest, prosecution and conviction rates within the criminal justice system are incredibly low, they therefore remain somewhat invisible and on the periphery. Therefore, what psychologists and others know about rape and sexual offending, and I'm happy for Troy to contradict me here later, what we know about sexual offenders is based on the detected perpetrators within the criminal justice system, who are often the stranger rapist, the child sexual offenders, not the majority of sexual offenders who are known to the victims. When we focus our attention on perpetrators, it's important to address some of the key causes or underlying factors of sexual violence. So on the one hand, we have individual factors that might lead to sexual aggression, such as mental health and personality problems, drug and alcohol abuse, adverse childhood experiences, biology, genetics, educational levels, stress, and so on. But there is no one cause, and many of these things, such as excessive alcohol consumption, are merely risk factors, not actually causes. On the other hand, it makes no sense at all to me to look at individual factors in isolation, and as such we must carefully examine the social and cultural context or background in which we live. Masculine entitlement, a hierarchy of gendered expectations and stigma and shame around sexuality are a huge part of the problem of sexual violence. Girls and women are taught that ideal femininity means being sexually attractive, passive and submissive, but also sexually respectable. Boys and men are taught that ideal masculinity means to be sexually promiscuous, tough, strong, aggressive, and in control. Most at risk include boys growing up in dysfunctional households where a gender hierarchy is being reinforced. Combined with excessive alcohol consumption, plus peer pressure for sexual promiscuity and proving one's masculinity, plus a constant reinforcement of popular culture that the bodies of women are there for consumption and a means ends for sexual desire. These things increase the likelihood that these men and boys will become sexually aggressive or predatory. So the greatest challenge is how to tailor primary prevention programs. Primary prevention means to prevent something before it even occurs in the first place. So how do we come up with primary prevention programs to target and reach these boys and men and their peers who provide support to them? In other words, how do we address problematic norms and beliefs within a particular subculture where such views have been formed, supported, reinforced, encouraged, and normalised? So what needs to be done to address the problem of sexual assault in our schools, universities, and in our communities? Responses must include civil and criminal remedies, but also we need to think about a variety of educational programs and campaigns, including law enforcement training, mandatory respectful relationships and safer schools education in schools and universities, public awareness campaigns, greater support and advice to victims, and more in-depth and collaborative discussion among multiple stakeholders within our community. As educational centres, universities are well placed to address the problem of sexual violence as it occurs both within campus but also outside of campus. There must be measures that provide four key things. One is awareness, the second is support, awareness, support, education and remedies. So in conclusion, sexual assault is a problem at our universities, not simply because some university students are perpetrators, but also because young women in particular are more likely to be victims of rape during their university days. And because our universities, like other institutions and sectors of our community, have not been addressing this issue properly. But the problem is much broader. Our society as a whole has never dealt with this issue very well. A first step is to understand what the harms are. The harms of rape and sexual assault, of course, include the original violation of a stranger or a person known to you violating your trust, your personal dignity, and your sexual freedom. But the harms go far beyond the original act. The harms are also concerned with the collective stigma and silence attached to rape and rape victims. Such harms include the failure of friends, family members, and others to step in when a victim is at risk of being raped. It includes the failure of friends, family members, and others to provide support to victims, and it includes the failure of our institutions, including universities, schools, and the criminal justice system to adequately respond to allegations of rape. The problem is, and don't worry, I'm finishing very soon. I did time this, it was 17 minutes in my office. The problem is that rape and sexual assault are seen as a woman's problem, and the solution is often presented as something women should fix. So we need to invest our energies into breaking down these stigmas and stereotypes and providing adequate validation and support and advice to victims. But we also need to draw our attention to the perpetrator and the culture and the society that supports them. And I'm going to end with a quote from our former Police Commissioner, Ken Lay. We need to, quote, "consider the man who did it and the culture which encouraged it. I want you to consider why we so ardently place the emphasis on the woman. Why was she there? What was she wearing? Rather than on the man's indecent entitlement, grubbiness and criminality." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Our third speaker for today is Dr. Troy McEwen. Troy is a clinical and forensic psychologist at Swinburne University of Technology, and she's worked in both inpatient and community forensic mental health settings in addition to her academic roles. Her research interests include stalking, deliberate fire setting, and improving the assessment, treatment and management of individuals engaging in these and other problem behaviours. She's published studies on the psychological characteristics of stalkers, stalkers' intelligence, attachment styles, and the role of mental illness in stalking behaviour. Please welcome Dr. Troy McEwen. Troy.
That'll make you sound far more interesting than I actually am, I promise. Now, I was actually told I had slides for this, so is there an ability to put the slides up on the thing? Because I'm a good psychologist and I like to provide both a verbal and also a visual learning opportunity. There we go. If you can't read the slides, I'm sorry, I didn't realise it was going to be such a small screen, so I failed on that count. Look, my introduction there has just said I'm a psychologist by training. I am an academic as well. I work primarily these days as an academic doing research into stalking, family violence and other things. And in that context, I obviously come across sexual offending in those kinds of environments. I also have worked with sex offenders clinically and continue to do clinical work today. So I think I was probably invited just because there's that kind of forensic psychology factor, but also because I work with perpetrators. I talk to people who do this, and that's a reasonably rare thing, I think. Not very many people actually have the opportunity to speak to people who engage in sexual violence, and that's something that I, for my sins, get to do. So what I want to do today is really touch a bit on why people are sexually violent. Taking Nicola's points into account, because I think she's right. I think we know a limited amount, although I think probably slightly more perhaps than was suggested. So we'll talk about the caveats when we get there. I'll start off by talking about what actually is sexual violence, because it's a really diverse set of behaviours. If we think about the World Health Organization, they include things like unwanted sexual advances or contacts as sexual violence, what you maybe commonly call sexual harassment, although that's not entirely the same thing. Moving right through the spectrum of contact offending into rape, okay? So, but you've also got these other things like communications of a sexual nature, so what Nicola's obviously a specialist in, what we've already heard David speak about today with the Skype issues. But there's also things like violating property rights for sexual purposes. So a lot of the clients I work with are voyeurs. They like to look through windows and that makes them sexually excited when they watch women get undressed. Or theft of things that make them sexually excited, this kind of fun stuff. The key element to all of this, and the key thing that makes it obviously wrong, is that it's non-consensual. So I think everyone in the room can agree, non-consensual means it is coercive. You talk the person into it, you do it against their wishes, or it can be more forcefully coercive. It's physically aggressive, intimidating, threatening, or like. Or you're not able to consent because you're, a child and you can't comprehend the nature and consequences of the act, or because you've got some other reason for that, such an intellectual disability or intoxication or whatever. So when I talk about sexual violence throughout this presentation, this is what I'm talking about. And I think we can probably, what these guys said is exactly the same. I'm just putting some parameters around it because that's what scientists like to do. So I want to pick up on some of the things that have already been said, because one of the best ways of thinking, one of the most helpful ways of thinking about causes of various human behaviours is to think at this multiple level kind of in this way. Nicola's really talked there about the ideas of culture. David's obviously also given us a lovely definition of culture, and community, and how those things can play out. As a psychologist, I tend to focus much more on the individual and the interpersonal. So the person and the context in which they do things and how their relationships with other people might influence that. That's the nature of my discipline. We think about people and we look at what's going on in their head. That said, obviously, as Nicola really nicely, I think, summarised, what's going on in the culture and the society absolutely filters down into the individual. And so what I want to talk about over the next 10 minutes or so is how does that look when you're talking to someone who's actually doing this? How does that look? How does that come out? We can hear, everyone's, I'm sure, seen things like The Hunting Ground, read stories, read articles about how these attitudes or hostility towards women or whatever, what the problems are. But how does that actually work for a person who's doing it? How does that work in their own head? Because I'm sure most of us in the room here could never think, how do we get from being in a culture and being in a society to someone doing this? Because, of course, we all live in the same culture. We all live in arguably similar kinds of societies in Australia with various subcultures, but most of us don't do this. So what is it for the people who do it? And to me, that's a really interesting question. Most of my work life is spent thinking about that. It's fun. All right, so it might sound a little bit trite, and this is very much a simple kind of way of putting it, but you get a behaviour like sexual violence, but really like any kind of offending behaviour, when you take a motivated person who's got sufficient things going on in their life at that time that come out of their background and their history and their learning, and you put them in a situation where they perceive that they have the opportunity to get something good out of it. I mean, fundamentally, that's where any kind of behaviour comes from. It's a very simple model. Obviously, there's lots of complex stuff that goes on in there, but it's the easiest way, and this is the way I actually talk about it with clients. When I talk to clients about why did this happen when it did, we talk about what part of it was you and what part of it was you in your situation. Yeah? So what I want to do is make a little bit of a false dichotomy when I talk about this, because I think it's really important to think about the full range of sexual violence. And Nicola gave that really lovely quote about the spectrum of sexual violence from, kind of street harassment through to rape. And I think it's really important when we think about people who are perpetrating sexual violence to think about what kind of violence they're perpetrating, because different kinds of violence come with different causes. Yeah? The cause of someone who, a violent stranger rape, to take this very stereotypical kind of thought about sexual violence, a violent stranger rape, the causes of that are likely very, very different to the causes of an unwanted kiss at a party. Both of those are sexual violence, okay? But they're very different in their scope, they're very different in their potential consequences, and they're very different in the causes for the person who does it. That's not to say the person who does one can't do the other, of course, but we do have to think about them a little bit more, in a bit more nuanced way. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about, in a bit of a false dichotomy, the idea of sexual violence that doesn't involve physical aggression. The reason I'm using physical aggression as the defining feature is because the move from coercing someone into sexual violence by making them feel guilty or making them think they owe that to the perpetrator or making them think that that's what women should do or what boys should do or what any kind of target should do, that is a qualitatively different thing to threatening to physically harm someone if they don't do what you want. Okay? When you think about it from a perpetrator's point of view, which is what I spend my life doing, those two things are quite different. Now, some people do both, many people do one or the other. Right? The kinds of things that we can think about in terms of what motivates a person to engage in unwanted coercive, sexual assault, essentially. I think quite often there's actually a belief that what they're doing isn't sexual violence. And this comes back to how our societies define sexual violence. When I say the stereotypical act is the stranger rape on the street, that's what we think of as sexual violence. That's what a lot of young people think of as sexual violence. There is a real misapprehension, and I see this in talking to some clients, there's a misapprehension about what sexual violence is, what violence is, and what can cause harm. And so whilst they might think sexual violence is really bad and I would never do that, they don't think that's what they're doing, so they've got very little motivation not to do it. Right? So a fundamental incorrect belief about what is and isn't sexual violence, I think for a significant proportion of that less egregious, it's a very qualified term, I realise that's a problematic way of putting it, but the less egregious, less physically violent sexual violence is actually misunderstood, I think, by perpetrators. Doesn't excuse it in any way, shape or form, but it's a nice way of thinking about why might it happen in some situations and not others. The other kinds of things we might think about and look at are kind of being stolen my thunder a little bit over there, Nicola, thanks very much, but that's all right. We talk about attitudes a lot. What is an attitude, all right? So an attitude is essentially like an evaluative statement or an evaluative belief. It says something is good or is bad, fundamentally. And we can see for people who perpetrate kind of sexual violence, particularly in relationships where they perceive that guilting someone into it, which is by far the most common thing reported by perpetrators, guilting or talking someone, their partner, into sex when they didn't really want it. That's by far the most common form that is reported in non-adjudicated perpetrators. They generally believe that that's actually okay. And that's okay, it's not a bad thing because of a range of different beliefs. One, that's how relationships work. It's the woman's responsibility to be the gatekeeper of sex. It's the woman's responsibility to be the one who stops. It's the man's responsibility to initiate. It's the woman's responsibility to stop it. And that's kind of a really quite dominant, unvoiced script within relationships. Obviously, that works quite differently in same-sex relationships. And I think that's something that's very challenging because there's some good research to suggest that people who engage in same-sex sexual relationships, whether or not they're gay, straight or otherwise, they actually may be at increased risk in their relationships of sexual violence. And so there's obviously some different scripts going on there that are influencing that. Things about relationship expectations, who is owed what, entitlement. These are the things that filter down from the society. The kinds of statements that I see or I hear from my clients are things like, But she didn't say no, so it couldn't have been a problem. I mean, you know, you guys can all think of these statements. It's not just made up in the movies. People actually say these things. You know, there is a reason they say this in television and stuff. They sound obviously ridiculous to anyone, hopefully anyone in this room. But if you take a person who's learnt in their whole life that that's actually true, you know, there's no reason for them to think otherwise. We then have this interesting kind of thing, which I think is mostly people think about for adolescents, but I think it's very true for young adults as well, but it's a lack of alternatives. So once we're in the process of starting to have a sexual encounter, how do you stop it? How do you actually go about saying, no, hang on, or even as the person, let's be gendered for a second and say that the guy is commencing this and kind of doing the driver, how does he say, actually, I'm not comfortable with that anymore, I have to stop? You know, and that comes down to education and sexual awareness and having language to talk about these situations. It's all the same stuff that comes down to who says put the condom on. It's the same kinds of discussions, but it's about a very different kind of thing. And the lack of having a language to speak about that in the individual can actually lead them to do things so they don't see an alternative. They have a script for keep doing it this way. They don't have an alternative way to get out of that script. Sounds a little bit excusey, but it's not how I mean it. It is actually how people, when you're working with a person, you have to break it down to that kind of stuff because you can't talk about culture to people and make it relevant to their life in every case. You just can't. Okay. The kinds of opportunities that might contribute to this kind of particular violence, disinhibition's a really big one, and the most common disinhibitor is obviously intoxication, whether it's alcohol or something else. The thing I want to emphasise is, yes, disinhibition of victims does make them vulnerable. That is a reality. It does make you vulnerable. I'm not blaming victims for being drunk. I'm saying it makes people vulnerable. But equally, disinhibition of the perpetrator makes them vulnerable to doing it because they're not thinking through consequences. They're not thinking through what happens next. They're thinking about right now and thinking about what's going to feel good now. Again, not an excuse, but certainly a contributor. In that state, you often get cue misinterpretation. There's good research to show that perpetrators of sexual violence within relationships in particular often misinterpret social cues and misinterpret when someone's indicating yes or indicating no, and that is an issue. Previous sexual interaction between the perpetrator and victim can set up a situation where you have someone who believes that one consent applies to the next four times. Sorry, doesn't. Fundamental misapprehension. But also this idea that in our relationship, that's how sex always works. And so, it's that behavioural script idea. I think these guys have very clearly talked about the lack of obvious negative consequences and issues around peer pressure and expectations around sex. I'm not going to go into it, but I do want to emphasise it is enormously important that a person perceive that there could be a negative consequence for themselves as well as for the other person. And at the moment, I absolutely agree with these guys that the lack of both discussion but obvious shaming is a really important thing. It's not going to stop it happening. I'm not going to pretend that. I don't think there's any group in this country who are shamed and denigrated more than child sexual offenders, yet child sexual offending still occurs. Okay. Just because we're publicly against it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. But it's an important part of reducing the frequency with which it does happen. Moving on to that other slightly unrealistic, but let's just go with it for a moment, side, but the sexual violence that involves physical aggression. Okay, so physical aggression or threats of intimidation, the victim is scared because of the perpetrator's actions. The perpetrator is intentionally making them scared to facilitate sexual violence. This is a slightly different group. This is the group that's much more likely to be involved in criminal justice settings because of what Nicola said. They're more likely to get charged if they've used physical force or threat. This group is generally much more antisocial. We know this from family violence studies. The majority of sexual violence does occur within family relationships, within intimate partner relationships in particular. And we know from looking at people who perpetrate family violence that those who are more antisocial, who are more aggressive outside the relationship, are more likely to be physically aggressive or sexually aggressive within the relationship. There is a link between the two things. Okay, so someone who has general attitudes supportive of aggression those attitudes will generalise across into sex and into the use of sex for violent ends. Right? There's also all those very sexual violence specific beliefs. So Nicola touched on some of these. So the kinds of things we're looking at here around gender, with hypermasculinity, everyone's heard of that. You can think of hypermasculinity. Think of this sounds really terrible, but here we go. the character in Jerry Maguire, do you remember Jerry Maguire, 1990s film, the football character and the football team in that environment? It's this enormously masculine environment, and there's this moment in that film where the TV reporter comes into the change rooms afterwards to do an interview, and she's doing an interview with a guy who's naked from the waist down. The TV camera's on his waist up, and he just doesn't have anything on from the waist down. That is the definition of a hypermasculine environment. Right? It's so masculine that the fact that a woman's in there, there's just not even a thought to the fact that you might need to cover that up because someone's in here who's not usually used to seeing you naked. That's actually, because that is actually exposure. That's exhibitionism right there. Right? That's actually illegal. All right, so hypermasculine environments are a real problem, but more than that, we've got people's stress internally about whether they're measuring up to that environment. So gender role stress. Am I being the kind of guy that I should be, which is the culture coming down to the individual again, right? So what do I have to do to prove I'm the kind of person that I should, the kind of man particularly? But I also think the kind of woman, I just actually don't think there's enough research about that. I think there's some gender role stress for women who perpetrate sexual violence as well, but that's another day. Then we have relationship-related stuff. So things about, quite often you see in these kinds of relationships, an environment where sex becomes part of and a way of exerting control. So sex is about sex. It is about sex, but it's also about exerting control and maintaining control over the other partner's behaviour. I think most people are hopefully aware of the literature around that and what that's like. But sex becomes very much a way of, this kind of sex that involves physical force, a way of controlling what your partner does and when they're going to leave you and when they're going to fight with you and all that kind of thing. That comes with high emotional arousal and anger. High levels of anger, high levels of hostility in general are massively associated with sexual violence that occurs in the context of fights within relationships. I want to touch on sexual deviance really quickly. How much time have I got?
About 4 minutes.
Okay. I'll touch on sexual deviance very quickly because I think there's a misconception that sexual deviance and sexual violence are inherently related, and they're not. Obviously, there's a correlation. But sexual deviance is just a stable pattern of non-normative sexual arousal. Okay, so some kinds of sexual deviance are socially acceptable and not likely to result in sexual violence, like masochism. Some kinds of object-related fetishism. Some kinds of sexual deviance are criminalised, or at least the behaviours associated with them are criminalised because they are obviously harmful and socially unacceptable, like pedophilia, non-consensual sadism, these kinds of things. But having a pattern of sexually deviant arousal doesn't mean you're going to be sexually violent. Okay? Just like most of you, when you see someone you think is sexually attractive on the street, you probably don't jump on them and try and have sex with them, hopefully. Most people with deviant sexual arousal don't either. Right? Just because you have a deviant pattern, like a non-normative pattern of sexual arousal, doesn't mean you're going to act on it. Okay? The people we see who have it, they act on it and they get in trouble. So we're seeing a very particular group. Equally, you can be sexually violent without having deviant sexual arousal. Okay? That's absolutely common. In fact, for example, in child sexual abuse, the majority of men who have sex with children do not have preferential pedophilia. Less than 10% of men would meet diagnostic criteria for preferential pedophilia. Okay? Sexual deviance and sexual behaviour, sexual violence, are not one and the same thing. That said, there is a small group of men, and it is predominantly men, who clearly have deviant patterns of arousal, and their sexual violence is an effort to fulfil that sexual desire. Okay? When that's present, that's very concerning, and it's a risk factor for further offending. But it is the minority of these cases. Let's not walk out of this room thinking that everyone who perpetrates this has a deviant pattern of sexual arousal, because that's not what's going on. Okay? The kinds of contexts that this kind of violence arises in, I've already mentioned relationship conflict, biggest thing. It's most often happening in intimate relationships and most often happening in the context of other violence. Okay. Those negative external consequences, again, so important. Nicola's already spoken about it. I do want to touch on the issue of vulnerable victims. I don't want to get into victim blaming, that's not what I'm here for, but I do want to talk about vulnerable victims as a risk factor because people who are motivated to do this will target people where it's more likely to be successful. That's the reality. It'd be lovely if we lived in a world where that wasn't the case, but that is the case. It's just like kids, there are some kids who are more likely to be sexually abused than other kids because they are vulnerable, because they have characteristics that make them an easy target. And in this kind of situation, easy targets are people who are socially isolated or isolated in the situation, i.e. walking home alone at night. It is actually a vulnerability. Not the victim's fault for doing it. They should absolutely be allowed to do it in every situation. But it does make you vulnerable to a motivated person. Okay? Being intoxicated makes you vulnerable because if you have the unfortunate luck to run into a motivated person, it makes you vulnerable that you're intoxicated. Okay? Or in other ways perceived to be an easy target of some description. Okay? In no way that should be interpreted as victim blaming. Think about it as there are choices we make as people in society, and I would include we here because it's not just women, it's men as well. Men can make choices that make them vulnerable to assault. They're just less likely to get sexually assaulted. Men who make the choice to walk down King Street with a group of their friends on Saturday night while they're all highly drunk and kind of get into a bit of it at the traffic lights, they are making choices that make them vulnerable. Right? Not blaming them for doing it, they should be allowed to do it, but it makes them vulnerable to motivated people. Okay, I'm going to finish up by going, we got all this stuff about individuals and what goes on in their own heads. Okay, it's fine. How's that actually going to help us? I think just like we think about these kind of different kinds of sexual violence slightly differently with the kind of causes, we have to think about the kinds of interventions a little bit differently too, because the reality is that the kinds of primary prevention that Nicola talks about are going to stop a particular kind of sexual violence, and that's the high prevalence kind. Okay? It's the kind of sexual violence that can be stopped by convincing people that sexual violence is wrong and all these things come under the banner of sexual violence, so you shouldn't do them. Okay? That's what primary prevention can do. Unfortunately, there's a political problem here, because to do that really effectively, you've got to target kids, because the most common age for being a perpetrator or a victim of sexual violence is 14. All right? Most sexual violence occurs towards young people and it's committed by young people. That's the reality. So to do this effectively, we have to be targeting kids. And I don't know about you, but I'd love to go to the government right now and say, let's put an education thing about sex into our primary schools. That hasn't caused any problems recently, has it? Right? So there's some issues, right? It also obviously needs to be linked in with the kind of respectful relationship thing that Nicola was talking about, because it's so much a part of family violence and partner violence. It's absolutely integrally tied to it. Last slide, don't worry. The other kind, if we move to the kind of more physically aggressive kinds of sexual violence, which are thankfully lower prevalence. They genuinely are lower prevalence than the other kind. You need to add in some stuff to the primary prevention. You have to add in general violence prevention. People are violent because they support the use of violence, not in this situation or that situation. They are supportive of violence. There is good evidence of this, that violent people think violence is okay across situations. So it's not just about education and knowledge about sexual violence, it's education and knowledge about violence, whether that's sexual or family or by a man or by a woman or whoever. Violence, and we have ways of saying violence is not okay, and this is how you should handle it in a different way without being violent. Then there's other kinds of prevention for people who are at risk. So selective prevention is like where you target people who have risk factors. So for example here at adolescents, boys who are abused, who are sexually abused between the ages of 10 and 13, there's got great research in Victoria here that shows that's the group that's more likely to commit sexual offences as adults. Okay, it's a very particular age that's associated with later sexual offending. That group should be getting education around healthy sex when they are victimised. Identify them as a victim and then give them, oh crap, they might be perpetrators. You don't word it like that because, But that's the kind of targeting we need to do, right? Similarly, things like adults with intellectual disability who are much more likely to both perpetrate and be victimised. Programs for them. Because if you're implanting those programs, you will reduce the overall rate because these are the people who do it. It's terrible, sounds terribly labelling, and the vast majority of people with intellectual disability never sexually offend, but they are still an at-risk group. And then we've got identified prevention for those who we know are sex offenders, for that little tiny group that would get through to the criminal justice system. We know they've done things, and there is evidence-based treatment. It does work. There is good evidence to show that sex offender treatment is effective when it's delivered in appropriate ways, and it does exist in Victoria. And for those people, it does need to be there. I'm going to finish by touching very briefly on preventative detention, because sometimes people think we just lock them all up. You're right. Preventative detention probably is necessary for a very, very small and very unique group of people, all right? And it needs to be done in very careful ways for very specific reasons. If you're interested in this kind of issue, the Harper Review, which came out a month or so ago, is a very good discussion of when preventative detention might be appropriate and the kinds of conditions that it might be appropriate under. It's certainly not the option that we should be using in all cases. And at that note, I'll finish. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Troy. And yes, what could be the problem with taking sex education programs into schools? Who would have thought? Thank you very much, all three of you. Fascinating presentations. We have a small period of time for questions, and I'd invite you to think of questions while I ask David a question, because I was thinking when you were talking about the drawing a clear line as soon as a perpetrator's, the allegations against a perpetrator being taken seriously, to some extent that goes against traditional understandings we have in institutions about innocence until proven guilty. I'm just curious to know how you managed to achieve what was presumably a change in the army to the way in which you dealt procedurally with these cases, so that you were able to exclude alleged perpetrators before they were sort of proven perpetrators.
Not for one moment would I argue that we should just completely throw the presumption of innocence, out of the equation. And clearly, we've got to have that. But I think for a very long time, centuries, millennia perhaps, we've tolerated levels of aberrant behaviour that don't fit within well-established societal mores, centred around respect for other people. And you can make dramatic corrections if you are prepared to find ways in which victims are listened to and supported and not judged. And both Nicola and Troy have spoken about that, as well as having the means by which an alleged perpetrator can be removed from the alleged victim's orbit, so that that individual is not continuing to feel threatened. And for a university, that is exceptionally difficult. For an army, it's exceptionally difficult. And to cut to the chase, we simply made decisions about removing people geographically from their victims or alleged victims, and in some cases absolutely suspending them from service, where there was a weight of evidence that proved that that was the most responsible leadership position to take. But of course, every case should be judged on its merits, and what I've just said does fly in the face of a number of long-standing conventions. But let's face it, we haven't really created Camelot.
Thank you, David. And it seemed to link well to what Nicola and Troy were saying about the presence or absence of negative consequences and the difficulties of process. So, questions, please.
David, your role is so vast and so varied. But what would you consider is the most important or most pressing issue for Australia and Australians today?
Look, I don't think that I'm qualified to give an answer other than to say that from my experience, domestic violence and what the consequences of domestic violence, which spill out into violence in so many areas, interpersonal violence, violence in particular areas such as a campus or, a nightclub district or whatever. I think that probably is the one that we should be addressing most particularly. But as I said right at the start of my address, from my understanding of this very complex issue, it sits not exclusively but largely in the way our culture and our society absolutely favours one gender over another. And there is an enormous amount of gender inequality that for a middle-aged Anglo-Saxon white guy like me, when you start to see it, you just can't unsee it. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's every time you open a computer, to every time you look at a billboard, to every time you hear people talking about issues in a social gathering. It's everywhere, and we should be doing something about it, trying to create a world that's safer, as I say, for our sons, but particularly our daughters.
Question here.
I'm just very interested in the panel's view on an aspect of sexual violence that has come to the fore more frequently as we've talked about it, which I wasn't really aware of, and that is situations where the perpetrators actually drug their victims, which seems to me to be the ultimate abuse, the ultimate violence, and it's a really kind of distressing and disturbing psychology to me that perpetrators would do that, and I'm just interested in the panel's comments and responses to that, because I think that's something that we're hearing more and more of.
Troy, that might be on the perpetrator end of things. Huh?
Sure. Okay, so I think if you think about perpetrators, I can't tell you what the stats are on it. I have no idea whether it is more common than it used to be. My guess is given drugs are more, like drugs that can make them unconscious are more easily available through the internet. My guess is more people have used them, but that's my guess. So I don't know if it's more common. That said, people who choose to do that are obviously making a choice to engage in rape, essentially, in the easiest way they possibly can. The easiest way, of course, you can engage in rape is if the person isn't able to fight back or protest. And so, as a practitioner, if a client came to me with that kind of offence, I would be very much thinking about what is it about this person's attitudes and beliefs and the way they view themselves and their target, whether that's the specific victim or a broader range of victims, that allows them to think that that's justified or okay in a particular situation. Of course, they actually don't think it's okay. They do realise it's not the right thing to do. They just think they're more important than the right thing to do, right? It's not, they fundamentally don't understand that it's wrong. They get that it's wrong. They just don't care in that kind of situation because they're making a very obvious choice to do something. So therefore, there's a very clear message to anyone looking at them. They're making a choice to do it despite the fact it's wrong. They are in their sexual gratification and their enjoyment of them and their mates or whoever else is involved is more important than the effect on the person and the fact that it's wrong. I mean, it sounds simple, but at some level, it is simple. Now, the reasons that they're making that choice, the reasons they think that are the complicated bit, yeah? But that would be my, going into that kind of interview with someone who's done that, that would be walking in how I would approach it, and I'd be trying to work out what got them to the point to allow them to think that that was something that they were entitled to do.
Can I just add to that as well? The other scenario, which is the kind of less extreme form of that, is a person plying another person with a lot of alcohol, so that they'll essentially get them into the same state.
Yeah.
I think we've got time for one more.
Hi, my question's for Troy. Thank you for your paper, that was wonderful, very informative. You talked about risk factors for adult women. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what the risk factors are for kids. I mean, after your paper, I want to go and get my kids from childcare and I can never let them leave the house again. No. So
the kind of thing that I was referring to is that there's good research showing that young children who are victims of physical abuse in their own home are more likely to be sexually abused by someone outside their own home. It's because there's not supervision. Kids who, whilst I don't want to encourage people to be helicopter parents, if there is a significant lack of supervision of children, they are more vulnerable. And usually if the family life is really terrible and the kids spend lots of time outside, out in the street, if they're there all the time, people who are motivated will see that. If you live in areas where people who are poor and take lots of drugs and aren't very adaptive, which sounds terrible, but the reality is that lots of sex offenders are poor and take lots of drugs and aren't very adaptive in their lives, and so they live in those areas too. Just by chance, you're going to have more of them around you. Sounds terrible, but it's true. So there's kind of vulnerabilities to kids in terms of, it's not about the kid, it's about the environment they're in and what they're looking for. They're looking for adults to support them because their parents don't, and so they're more likely to make friends with people who seem friendly. That's the grooming stuff, and it works the same way for adult victims and child victims.
Look, it's been an absolute privilege to hear from our three speakers this afternoon, each of whom, in their own different ways, are absolute experts in their field, but have been able to communicate that so beautifully in a short space of time. And I apologise for hurrying you up a little bit, but I did want to leave time for questions at the end. Could I ask you to thank all three speakers in the normal way? Thank you. Very good. In closing, I'd invite Professor Robert Manne back onto the stage just to say... Okay, do it from there, Rob.
I just want to do such a rich discussion that I feel, and some of you might feel you'd like to go over it again, just to say that we always put these discussions on the website at La Trobe, but also the monthly magazine will have a film of it, so I'll certainly look at that, and some of you might like to. Second thing I want to say is today's event is because of the fundamental work of Dr. Corinne Manning, and I thank her very much. It wouldn't, the choice of speakers.
Thank you all, and it's possible for those of you who didn't get to ask your question, Laurie, that the speakers may be able to stay for a little bit longer just to have an informal chat, but thank you all very much.